Hello, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Oceanitalians YouTube channel. It is the first time I interview a relator from not an Italian country, and so I'm very privileged to talk to Dr. Klaas, who is a chief scientist of the Coming Up cruise to South Georgia. Hello, Christine. Welcome on Oceanitalians.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
Well, Christine, I know Christine from my older PhD times, and I had an opportunity to meet her during my vacation in Germany. And so, as soon as she told me that she was planning this cruise, I thought it was a great opportunity to share with the audience of Oceanitalians what it really means to organize such a type of cruise and what are the main scientific questions behind it. But as I always start, Christine, I always care that the speaker briefly introduce herself. So if you could please give us an overview of who you are, what is your position at the Alfred Wegener Institute? You're talking from Bremen, so that we all have a chance to know you.
Yes, so my name is Klaas. I'm a researcher or senior scientist at the Alfred Wegener Institute for Polar and Marine Research. This is the German institute that does research in the Arctic and Antarctic. And I work there as a senior scientist, and from my background, I'm a biological oceanographer, and I started my career basically in Switzerland when there's no ocean. I studied
Yeah.
biology,
Mhm.
and from then on, environmental protection, and then I shifted to oceanography during my PhD. I came to the Alfred Wegener Institute in '92, and I did my PhD in biological oceanographer. And then that's where I started really working in the Southern Ocean. And this is has been my focus um, at the AVI and through my career, I started with really more ecology of protist plankton, the unicellular organisms in the plankton,
Mhm.
which constitute most of the uh, biomass in the oceans, and also are responsible for oceanic primary productivity.
Mhm.
And then I shifted more and more towards sort of biogeochemical questions.
Mhm.
So what I'm trying now is to sort of couple the biology of organisms with large scale nutrient carbon cycling, food webs. So really trying to link the biology of organisms with the large sort of questions that are relevant for the Southern Ocean, but also globally, and also in relation to climate change.
Mhm. Yeah, so for sure, Southern Ocean is a perfect environment to talk about biogeochemistry. I remember
Yes.
from my studies, all the primary productivity is strictly related to the ratios between the main nutrients and the trace elements that, especially around South Georgia, are not um, in the, let's say, upstream of South Georgia, are not available, but are east of South Georgia. And since you told me that you just mentioned that you're from Switzerland, so what has triggered your interest for the marine environment since it was not part of your environment?
No, it was not, but it was part of my childhood growing up. I grew up in South America, and I spent quite some time in the Caribbean. I lived in Venezuela,
Mhm.
and actually and since a little kid, I was always gathering animals and things like that. So it was clear already as a toddler almost that I would be doing something related to biology. But I think it's through my experience as a teenager, basically, that oriented me more towards the marine environment,
Mhm.
uh, and um, and that's where when I finished my studies in Switzerland, I tried to apply to PhD positions in marine sciences.
Mhm.
So
Okay,
it's
wow, I forgot about.
childhood dream, basically, almost.
That's true, but this mentions a lot also how the experiences, no, of a life, of a person's life can really orient your interests and can really take you far away, because between Switzerland and the area of Bremen, where you are, Bremen and Bremerhaven, of course, it's really completely different. Very interesting. And so it's since you are your PhDs that you've been in Bremen, and now you're moving to the more organizational aspects of an oceanographic cruise. How many cruises have you participated to?
So through my career, I've in the Southern Ocean, I've participated in 7 cruises there.
Mhm.
And also these cruises provided me also the background for this project now. So it's all linked. It's also linked to the work you've carried out when you were at the Alfred Wegener Institute. That was also an inspiration for me to be in your PhD committee, actually, I remember.
Okay.
Yeah. And yeah, so I did 8 cruises in this, 7 cruises in the Southern Ocean, but also through my career in between, I also did cruises, sort of much shorter cruises in the North Atlantic mostly.
Always with
But
the
those,
same aims? Always or more related to the marine
no,
biology?
these were different projects. So after my PhD, I worked on other topics. And actually, that's also what drove my interest, or sort of, I would argue, defocused me on the biology to try and tackle more sort of global issues, because I worked with geologists who were interested in learning about coccolithophorids. These are also phytoplankton, unicellular phytoplankton, and were important in terms of for the geological record, for reconstructing the past, and also dating geological record. And after that, I also work in global modeler with global circulation biogeochemical models. So I sort of drifted from the biology towards more these questions about what happened in the geological past, or the global study the global system. And that's kind of I went back to the Southern Ocean, but I use these past experiences to sort of widen the scope and the focus of my research. And as a consequence, also this cruise and most of the cruises I did are highly multidisciplinary. So we don't focus on single organisms, but on the whole communities, how the communities interact with the physical and chemical environment, and what the consequences are for the cycling of nutrients and carbon. Carbon is a big issue in the Southern Ocean because the Southern Ocean is a large sink for carbon, but also a large source. And it has a global significance, and also for past changes in the climate. For instance, the past changes in temperature are due to differences in CO2 concentration, and the biology in the Southern Ocean is responsible for a large part of these changes. So what happens in the Southern Ocean influences directly almost the whole planet, basically, in terms of atmospheric CO2 concentrations and the resulting temperatures. So
I think
yeah.
so. This really puts this cruise in a clear context in the current climatological situation, right? So it's not
Yeah.
only about studying what happened in the past, but also understanding what could be the projection in the future. And I think what's really interesting, what you just mentioned, and I don't think it's a topic that a lot of people talk about, especially outside the scientific community. What is the strong role of the Southern Ocean in all of this? I think it's really interesting how you mentioned the role of the Southern Ocean as a sink. In the
Mm.
example of South Georgia, I know you have a slide to share, and I think that will show it very well. Plays an important role as a sink, but we do have also the sources of CO2. So the issues of climate change are, as you mentioned, global, and every part of it, every part of the system can play an important role. And so this year, as you mentioned, you are going to be the chief scientist of this cruise.
Yes. So we put in a proposal. Like I said, the original motivation. I mean, there are three avenues. One is that I've also participated in all the iron fertilization experiments in the Southern Ocean
And
that
that's how
were
we met.
carried out by the Alfred Wegener Institute. You also participated in the last one. And these experiments, they showed us how important iron is. I mean, iron is really the true limiting element for primary production in the Southern Ocean. So, and then also the fact that if you look at the new estimates of the carbon sources and sinks at a global level, like I said, the Southern Ocean is one of the most important sinks, but is also an important source. And actually, the area south of the polar front where we will be working is considered a source of CO2, but there are exceptions. And the exception is the area downstream of South Georgia. So this is one of the few CO2 sinks south of the polar front.
I was
The
thinking,
reason,
Christine, since you're mentioning the area that of the cruise, I can share the slide that you prepared, so maybe you can anticipate where the cruise will take, and you can show on the map where.
can you see my cursor?
No,
No?
maybe you can see mine, so I could use mine.
Yeah, so anyway, so here you have the maps with the cruise track. So the map on the left-handed side is the whole cruise track. We're starting in Cape Town, South Africa, and we'll steam southwards and then start our scientific work by doing different transects. Is the sort of the red lines with the little white circles. Those represent the sort of the transects where we're going to work and do station work, but we'll also tow instruments and have really very high resolution data on physics and some of biogeochemical um, properties that we can measure using sensors. So these transects, each transect will be carried out twice, once with a towed system, so to have information at the really low, at sub-mesoscale resolution, so really, really high resolution. And then we'll do the same transect again, this time with stations where we'll collect samples and measure, for instance, iron, nutrients, and biological and geochemical process, sedimentation, basically the whole suite of measurements that you need to interpret both the biological data, species distribution, abundances, but also fluxes of elements and the cycle of elements. And so we have a broad range of measurements, but we also need those measurements because you can't interpret one set of data just by itself. And in that respect, we're multidisciplinary. So we have teams, that physical oceanographer teams, geochemical teams, biological teams, chemical teams. And the idea in the end is to use this data both to interpret the processes we observe, but also try to do sort of large-scale estimates of the fluxes, carbon fluxes, productivity, and also look at, because the Southern Ocean is extremely undersampled, and even the areas that are sampled, and that doesn't apply just to the Southern Ocean, but to the whole ocean, are sampled at very low resolution.
Yes.
And we know that the hydrological process or physical processes at much higher resolution are also important. And we don't have information on those, and that's a global issue. And we're trying to look at that here. So how the resolution affect, for instance, budgets of carbon, the regional budgets of carbon, primary productivity, and things like that. So we're very looking at really a lot of different aspects and unknowns within this system.
And this is, in fact, now you're mentioning the high resolution and how processes are related on the high resolution. The physical processes that you can understand from high resolution measurements. Of course, I stopped working on the Southern Ocean after my PhD, and I started working on the Mediterranean. And this is exactly what we were trying to look at, how the high resolution physical processes were determining other aspects that generally are just not seen, because from the CTD transects, you're not able to see them. Also, just by the time that you take your sample and you move to the next station, you miss all the changes that otherwise you are able to see with the towed instruments.
So I think we can start with a figure on the right-hand side that illustrates that a little bit. So this is the same thing. So we have our cruise truck, that's the black line, and the background is the average concentration of phytoplankton pigments, chlorophyll, for mid-October. And this is about the period where we'll be in the area. And the color, so the purple blue are areas with very low chlorophyll, which means very low phytoplankton biomass. And as the towards the green and the red, then you get higher phytoplankton concentrations. And you can see here how patchy this phytoplankton distribution is, and also how much pattern there is. And these are patterns that are probably driven by these really small scale physical processes. So and normally we don't resolve this variability, and so we do extrapolations with very few data points over large areas, and there are lots of errors associated to that. So we want to try and see, what are the errors related to the low resolution of measurements that are carried in a standard way by all the oceanographic community. So
yeah, exactly.
And we have a unique opportunity here, because we really combining very large scale. This is basically the whole Atlantic sector of the Southern Ocean, with information on the tiniest scale of variability in the ocean. So and that covering as many parameters, biogeochemical parameters, as we can.
So, and then it's also because you said that each
have fancy equipment on board. Interesting.
I imagine. Yeah. And every time you work with multidisciplinary, I think this is a first requirement, because now you're talking mostly about the physics, but then you were mentioning all the biogeochemistry. So also the towed instrument will measure biogeochemical variables.
Yes, so we'll have high resolution data on, for instance, the physical conductivity, temperature, but we'll have also sensors for oxygen, for nutrients. We have cameras, so we'll also have in this system towed camera systems, so that we don't only get physical and chemical data, but also an idea of the distribution of the biology from the smallest phytoplankton up to the larger sort of grazers.
Yeah, that will be captured by the images. Very interesting. So I remember when we were on the Lohafix cruise, we did have a participant who had a little camera taking images during the CTD stations. But I think on the TODA instrument also is very interesting, as it gives you also the spatial variability, not only the vertical variability. And here in the map on the right, it's what you were mentioning, that you also trace the different fronts of the ACC.
Exactly. So so we're gonna cross basically the ACC flows from west to east, and what we do is crossing the flow of the system from both front. I mean, what we are interested in is, of course, the biology. But the biology follows also the hydrography, and you can see that the white lines here represent these fronts. And you can see that the green patches of high productivity are kind of more or less sandwiched between these fronts. And so, and again, how fronts limit the spread of this, the biology and nutrients, I suppose, is one of the questions also we're going to look at. But we're also going to look at differences in seasonality. Here, for instance, if you look at our cruise track, one part of the track is closer to South Georgia, but we have a part which is a bit further away towards the east, and you can see there are big differences in the biomass of plankton, and we want to understand why these differences are. And then to come to the main sort of title of the project, of course, and also based on our iron fertilization experiments, our hypothesis here is that these plumes of high productivity are due to iron input from the islands, because iron is very poorly soluble in seawater. And if you don't have inputs from either from dust, atmosphere, or from sediments, usually you get very low productivity because there is not enough iron. So our question is how much iron is delivered by South Georgia, how far does it go, and how it's transported. And we believe again that the biology here has a big role to play, that most of the iron is actually carried and recycled by the biology and not in dissolved form. And again, this is another aspect that we will investigate. So there are a lot of questions we'll look at, but they are all related in a sense, because you need, if you want to understand the Southern Ocean and the carbon fluxes in the area, you need to put this information together. And this is the kind of project, well, I'm interested in doing, basically.
Wow, it is. No, I think it's always groundbreaking to put together all these very different fields. Also, because I think sometimes it's one of those cases where the result of the result never is not equivalent to the sum, right? So you may get some results that you're not expecting. And I must admit that you're throwing me to my PhD, Christine, because for those who are listening, this interview, maybe those who don't know that my PhD all focused on the island of South Georgia. So I am really enjoying what you're telling us about. And also, I realized that some of the open questions that we had back then are still unanswered. So still understanding where the iron comes from and how it's spread in the area and how it's cycled are still questions that need to be investigated. Now, you're mentioning that the team is very multidisciplinary. So you have external partners other than the AVI?
Yes, we have partners from Denmark, South America, Brazil, Argentina, United States, Europe, other institutions at AVI. So is really trying to harness the expertise wherever it is, basically, and try to get the best expertise on board. And it, in a sense, it's even an advantage for us, because for a ship like Polarstern in Germany, we are requested to bring people from outside. Um, and it gives us also the opportunity to harness the best expertise wherever we can find it, basically. So it's also a good opportunity for teams from countries that do not have the luxury of having a ship like that, to be able to also participate and do research in polar areas. So at the AVI, we are also very happy to have, and we're encouraged to have as many partners abroad as possible. So
Okay, cool. So it is always an international environment. This is something I
yes.
remember from the Lohavix cruise, which was really incredible. So you're leaving
Yeah,
next
it's
week,
also
right,
a very big
Christine?
ship. No, there aren't that many ships that can take 50 scientists. I mean, so again, it also provides you the opportunity to really do a full round program because you don't have the space limitations. Of course, we always want more space, but compared to other ships that work mostly in the Atlantic, sort of non-polar areas, they tend to be much smaller. So here we are lucky to be able to have all these teams in one go and do the work together. Sorry.
No, no, really interesting. No, I think it's always good to share that because the power is, as you said, not to find the different expertise is also outside, and also I think the cultural differences also introduce some new way of thinking. No, in the same, although the written objectives are the same, but it doesn't mean that people coming from different countries will think a way out in a different way. So I think that's a part of the multidisciplinary and the multicultural experience of an expedition. So you were mentioning that you were, I don't know if we mentioned it before, but I know that you're traveling next week. So it is
Yes.
really, really soon.
Yeah.
And how long will the cruise be?
So it's about 47 days, almost 2 months. It's actually short. Most of my cruises were usually 60 days. So because the Southern Ocean is so far away and you can see there, you have to go to South America, and even from South America or South Africa, these are still long distances. You have to steam just to get to the area of study. So it doesn't make sense to make short cruises because the steaming time, just the time to get there, is too long. So the cruises there tend to be usually longer because of the logistic constraints. That is not so easy to get to a harbor and exchange crew and scientists. So
Yeah, I remember when we went to the cruise in Lovex, it took at least one week of steaming to get
yes,
to the first
so we
station.
will be steaming also 1 week to get to our first from South Africa. Yes.
And this somehow also relates to what you mentioned, right? That the data in the Southern Ocean are always very scarce and very few, and this is one of the reasons. So out of
Mhm.
47 days, you're already excluding at least 10, 12 days of sampling, just because
Mm.
it's so remote.
Yes.
And has there been sampling around South Georgia that put together the two different resolutions? So the toad, the resolution of, is it going to be a scanfish? Generally, toad's instruments are
No, it's
scanfish.
it's called a triaxis, and it's a relatively big system. It's a McCartney triaxis called. You can buy it off the rack, but then you have to install the sensors and make it work. So um, it's a yeah, it's like it's a same system as a scanfish, but much bigger.
Okay, I'm not aware. So this one includes the camera you were mentioning.
Yeah, it includes cameras, several sensors, also for to measure photosynthetic active irradiance. So everything basically that you can more or less measure with sensors. Uh, the group that's responsible for that at the AVI, they try to put every sensor, you as many sensors as you can to get as much information out of the system. So and now I think there's a really interesting development in data imaging also, and I think that's a big development because we are terrestrial animals, and I think it's important to see what's happening also, and not just do proxy measurements, but really, be able to see in situ how the particles are, what are the shapes, how organisms interact, and how they're distributed, and yeah.
Yeah, that's very interesting because I'm thinking when I was on board, I was taking care of the zooplankton sampling. And I remember, well, first of all, how underrepresenting the samples are, just because part of the zooplankton is able to escape, no, or the larger organism are able to escape, and how the camera could give you an understanding also all that part that you just cannot sample, not because it's not there, it's just because they anticipate now the arrival of the nets. So I think that it's going to be very interesting, especially I imagine under the area of the phytoplankton bloom that drives all the food chain that starts below it. And so I imagine that you will also be able to see some layering, right, on the
Yes.
not only the phytoplankton community but the zooplankton community. Is there
Yes.
any knowledge about that?
Sort of really detailed vertical distribution, not, but we have a good idea or where they are. We know that they do dial vertical migration. Um, but of course, again, these organisms. I mean, we think of plankton as just hanging around and responding, but they're not. Even the new molecular methods have shown that plankton they're complex and they interact, even at the level of bacteria. So it's not just a passive. They're not just passive. They're really actively uh, communicating in some way with each other, and also changing their environment. Um, in the same way, we now know that trees are connected to each other
Yes.
through mycorrhiza, and that it's much more delicate and complex interactions. I think the new information from molecular data in the ocean, from projects such as Tara Ocean, is showing the same thing, that these are not just cells that are passively uh, just sort of drifting, but they also interact with each other and with the environment. And this is very important for iron, for instance. Again, from low effects, we know now that the biology, the grazers, the zooplankton, that the whole community is really geared to recycle iron, and this and how they are linked to each other. This is also something we need to understand better. So.
Yeah, very interesting, Christine. It's really interesting. Now, one of the things I was wondering, because of course South Georgia is not the only sub-Antarctic island that shows in the satellite images so much productivity. So I understand that you have to start from somewhere, and maybe South Georgia is the best place to start with, thanks also to the amount of data and the history of measurements that you took with the AVI. But what about the other islands like Kerguelen or Crozet? Have you ever also thought of maybe conducting such research there to make a comparison?
So there's been work carried in the Crozet and Kerguelen, in Crozet by the British and in Kerguelen by the French. Very similar, but the thing is, their imprint on productivity is relatively small in terms of spatially.
Okay.
Whereas here, it really affects the whole Atlantic sector. And you can see it, like I said, this is an area where there's a carbon sink, and I'm 100% convinced that this is due to the biology there. So in terms of its impact, both in time and space, South Georgia is very special, this area. What's also very interesting is you can see further south, there's also a plume that goes along the Antarctic Peninsula and the Scotia Ridge. So there you have also islands. And it's the same thing, you also see these plumes. But this area is studied quite intensely. I mean, most of the Antarctic research programs tend to work along the Antarctic Peninsula, and there's almost no work done in this huge area that's a huge carbon sink. So that's the reason why we chose this area, because we really need more data there. If you want to make good budgets of global carbon, we need to have more data in this area. For me, it's more a scientific necessity because of the scale of this. That South Georgia, the impact that South Georgia, the scale at which South Georgia can impact the Atlantic sector of the Southern Ocean is special.
Yeah. Also, because in this image you don't fully see the full extent of the bloom, right? Because if I don't remember wrong, you may have blooms already at the first transect, in the far east.
So the bloom had stacked over the whole panel down to 0 degree. So, but again, so here it's early season. So now the blooms have reached about 20 degree west in this picture, but they later in the season, they extend in really over the whole Atlantic sector. So we want to also understand why there is a difference in seasonality between east and west. That's also part of our study, which is why we really want to sample the whole basin, basically.
Yeah, because by looking at these images, somebody who doesn't know the background information would think that it's the same bloom spreading east, while from what you're saying,
we don't know. That's the question.
Yeah, very interesting. I really look forward to hearing what the results will show. And then of course, now you mentioned a lot of in situ measurements, now many fields for the in situ measurements. How about the modeling side, the physical or the biogeochemical? Is that something that maybe would follow up?
Yes, that's planned. We have also written projects for PhDs to process this data, of course, but also to combine or incorporate, either compare our field data with the models, and eventually make recommendations for improving parametrization in the model. So that's part of the project, but that takes a little bit of time because we have to measure the samples, check the data quality, and so on and so forth. So this is kind of the last stage, but it's definitely the plan for the PhD students that are going to work on the samples from this campaign. And we have several projects. One is to make these global budgets, combining our data with also artificial development of tools to extrapolate using artificial intelligence, for instance. The other one is modeling. There are several plans in that respect.
Okay, so yeah, we know that the cruise is just the beginning of a very long project. And I think what's also interesting for those who are listening to keep track of this cruise, of this Polarstern expedition, as it will open up space maybe for other PhD students that are interested in attending. I imagine also Italian students, so I should promote this this project to my Italian colleagues. And are on cruises also master students accepted? Is it something that happens sometimes?
We have a few master students. We have PhD students. Master students can join the cruise either for their own research, and sometimes we hire them as helpers. There's in Germany they're called Hivis, so as helpers for the science, and those are sort of short-term contracts for cruises. We don't pay a lot of money, but I think it's the ideal platform to educate students, because first they learn about all the instruments, and I think it's important if you want to really go from your specific topic to more global. You have to understand how things are measured, not only in your field but also in other fields. What are the constraints, but also new ideas, because you have contact with like people outside of your field. So you learn a lot, also other ways of seeing things, of approaching problems. um, so I was on a cruise as a PhD student, and I must say, I think a cruise for education of a student is the best platform, actually, because you have very intimate, close contact with scientists from all sorts of disciplines, and also an in-depth understanding of what do physical oceanographers do, what do chemists do. It's a very deep knowledge which you gain, a broad but also deep knowledge of the science,
And the practical, right? The life cycle
and
of a
practical also.
measurement.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, because I think also maybe often happens that students work on data that have been already collected, and maybe they don't know where this number comes from and how much hard work there is behind it. And so I think yes, cruises are always the best. Also, like a life experience, not only under the scientific point of view, and to get out completely from the multidisciplinary. This is something I've always been curious. Also thinking of how my experiences on board were, where you, as you mentioned, you build up strong personal relationship. You work in an environment which is closed, where there is no people, there's no external, no influence. Do you think also maybe a psychologist could be interested, could be an interesting role of the psychologist to come and study the human aspect behind the
Well,
scientific
actually, we
things?
do have, not on board, but in our section, we had an anthropologist
Uh-huh.
who was studying, yeah, well, how scientists do science, basically,
Mhm.
and the culture of science and of doing science. So, yes, sure. I mean, why not? The problem is, of course, the ships we are always limited in space for the science. So, it's we try to take people, artists, the media. We try really to take people when we can, but of course, depending on which project, it's sometimes difficult, because you need so many staff just to do the measurements, that you don't have space for sort of disciplines that are a bit sort of outside of the core.
Mhm.
But like I said, when we can, we do try, and we've had artists on board, we've had media people on board. I don't think we ever had a psychologist, but like I said, at Avi, we do have we had, for instance, a visiting anthropologist that was looking us under the looking at us under the microscope.
Oh, I think that's really interesting because I think what science does is collect people, and there should be all the fields, right? Interacting with each other. Of course, I think also depends on how remote the region you're measuring, you're sampling, right? I mean, if it just takes 12 days to get there and go away, as soon as you get there, you have to make sure to have everybody working at least 24 hours a day just
Yes.
to get all the information you need. Cool. Oh, by the way, we have a question for you. So I will read it and maybe we can take these few last minutes of the interview to reply. So the question is, unfortunately, this person doesn't science. Anyway, she's saying, "Hi, Christine. Is there a possibility of South Georgia acting as a feeder of biota into the rest of the South Atlantic systems, or even further downstream seamounts, for example, that are driven by the ACC and bathymetry? What do you think about this possible aspect?"
Um, that's a good question. I'm not so sure about that. I mean, basically, yes. By the way, this is Talia, she's from South Africa,
Ah, cool.
and
Yes, your name is written. Hello, Thalia. Thank you so much for your question.
so we don't know. But like I said, we believe that the most of the iron is carried downstream by the biology. In which case, yes. But if you look at the plankton communities in South Georgia and further west, they tend to be a bit different. Um, and what I mean by that is you have the same species, but the species that form blooms that accumulate in South Georgia are a bit different, and that's probably because the growth conditions are different. Well, that's one of our questions actually. Is what how is the transport from South Georgia, and what is really transported from South Georgia? Because we also hypothesize that the iron is transported from South Georgia through the plankton and not in dissolved form.
Mhm.
So this is one of the questions. But in terms of species composition, it's pretty much in the same water masses and the same zone climatically. So it's not like you'll find completely different species between the east and the west. It's just the dominance pattern is a bit different. Um, but
Okay.
yes, that is part of our question. Actually.
Mhm.
So
You got me really thinking a lot, Christine. I have to look through this video again at least a couple of times to get in all this information. But
yeah,
that's
it's
the
a lot.
inside
It's
of
a
it.
lot of. There are a lot of aspects to this campaign actually,
And I
and
imagine this is
the
one of the
fun of it.
challenges.
I think we'll be busy the next 10 years with it.
Yes, but which is good. There's lots of place for the students that are the future students that might be interested in marine sciences. And I understand, I really can understand from all these questions the responsibility and the stress behind the chief scientist who has to lead such a cruise. Also, because once you get there, anything can happen. You can find anything, any situation can vary, right? And it could be unexpected. So the time went very fast, Christine. We are already at 47 minutes since we started, and I do care to close up in time so that we keep our schedule. But I really care to ask. You mentioned how you started. What made you understand that you wanted to talk about marine science? Of course, you know the field of STEM, women in STEM, is very very important. There are many aspects we could still talk about, but just to close up, one comment, one suggestion you would give to a student, girl, female or male, it doesn't matter, that would like to follow your steps?
Be resilient. It's difficult to be a scientist. It's because it's a very competitive field, and also in terms of career, there aren't that many positions available for everybody. So it's a tough journey, and I think the most important thing is resilience. Just keep at it. At least that's what I did. I
Very
also
resilient.
had periods where I thought, okay, this is the end and so on, and you just have to keep at it. Get
So it's
on
all of
with it.
ups and downs. Yeah, there
Yeah,
was a
exactly.
nice word from my, I remember, PhD supervisors, that when we have the very positive moment, we have to use this crest to push us
Mhm.
forward and be able to overtake the lows that, of course, come not only with the PhD but throughout the whole career.
Yeah. Yeah, I
Cool.
think PhD, everybody has those sort of phases in its PhD, and this is where you have to really just do it and keep at it. And eventually things will happen.
Yeah, things do happen. And in fact, I
Yes.
think that we met in 2009, and as you can see, we're still interacting. So many things happen in between. Cool. So, Christine, thank you so much for your time. I think we talked about so many things. I hope it will be also inspiring to those who have listened to us under a personal point of view and a scientific point of view. And of course, I cannot not say that I look forward to hearing from you when you're back. And if you have a chance with any other colleague, if you'd like to, I'll be very happy to talk about it again. And let's see how it goes. I wish you all the best. Ad Majora, Christine, and a lot of good luck to you and the whole Polarstern cruise. Please say hello to the ship from my side. I do miss my
I
Polarstern
will.
times a lot.
Yes.
All the
No,
best.
the crew we have is the one so there'll be some people
Oh,
who.
wow, cool. Hello from my side then. Please. All the
Okay,
best. Thank
so
you again. Ciao,
thank
Christine.
you. Bye bye,
Bye.
Talia. Also, thanks for joining.
That's cool. Yes. Thank you, Talia, for your question. Thank you very much. Okay, bye, everybody. Thank you for following. See you soon with the next live of Ocean Italians.